Welcome to your first lecture video. Make sure that you're taking notes not only on what you see on your screen, but also what you hear me say. And if you have any questions, write them down so that way we could address them in class. Here we go. These are the topics that are going to be covered in today's video. So we're going to be covering things from human migration all the way through the Columbian Exchange. And we're going to jump right into it. So here we go, human migration. Where did the first humans come from? The oldest skeletons that we have found, and what historians and scholars believe today, is that the first humans actually originate in Africa. And if you're looking at the top map, you're going to see how they aged out in the years that they did it. So thousands and thousands of years ago, humans originate in Africa, and eventually they leave Africa. So why do they leave Africa? Again, historians and scholars believe that humans left Africa in pursuit of food. So they were following animals, following food, and that leads them to leave Africa and into Europe and Asia, which you could do walking. And again, this happens over thousands of years. It doesn't happen, in one person's lifetime. So in the course of thousands of years, eventually they reach the edge of Asia, Siberia, Russia, and they reach something called the Bering Strait. Now remember, this is about 15,000 years ago. The world is experiencing an ice age. Most of the ocean's water that you see today is actually frozen into glaciers, into ice caps. And the sea level is less 360 feet than what you see today. So in many parts of the world, the ocean floor was exposed. And it allowed people to walk throughout the world without there being an ocean, because again, it's all in glaciers. This is how the first people migrated to the Americas, through the exposed ocean floor. And that exposed ocean floor is called the Bering Strait. So today, the Bering Strait is actually a sea. It's called the Bering Sea. But back then, that water that's there today was frozen. And so it allowed for people to walk through it or walk over it from Asia into North America. Once in North America, all the way at the very tippy top where Alaska is today, they make their way down through Canada, then into North America, and finally into South America. And this again happens thousands and thousands of years ago. So that's how people first come into the Americas. They start off in Africa and they branch their way out in pursuit of food. Now, when they get here, they start to create their own cultures, their own tribes, and these people that migrated over are what we call today Native Americans. Native Americans adapted to their environment. So, for example, if they were hunting large animals, then they would pursue these large animals. Eventually, once these large mammals and mammoths become extinct, they then readapt and focus more on fishing or on gathering nuts and berries and roots. Or they would hunt smaller animals like deer and moose and elk. The Native Americans became culturally diverse as they were spreading throughout North and South America. And depending on where they were living, they had different climates, which would mean the different types of homes that they had, what they were eating, even how their culture was set up in terms of who had power in their tribe, and etc. By 1942, American Indians spoke at least 375 different languages. And each of these language groups were different tribes or different nations. And each one of these different tribes or nations had a different chief, and they had a different council of elders. Some of the Native Americans learned to farm and they would grow food, but other Native Americans chose to have a little bit more of a mix of hunting and gathering and also fishing, again, depending on where you live. Now, we're not going to get into great depth about the different Native American tribes because you guys are going to have a nice project about that in class. But this is kind of just a brief opening into the early Americans that were living here and kind of what their life was like and their structure was like based on their environment. So I want you guys to think, based on that map that you just saw, how does the environment actually impact Native American lives? Think about it. You don't need to answer this question on your homework or on your notes, but I want you to have an answer for this because we're going to be discussing this in class. So let's start talking a little bit about the other continents, Europe. Now, Portugal and Spain are facing the Atlantic Ocean, and they're pretty close to Africa. And because of their situation or where they're situated on a map, they are seeking new trade routes and they're seeking to expand European influence. So, for example, if you're in Portugal or Spain and you want to go to India for spices, the way that you would go prior to European exploration is through land. You would walk through the rest of Europe and then eventually into Asia. The Portuguese were looking to to venture out into the Atlantic. And they were able to venture out to the Atlantic because of several new devices that came about, new technology. And you have them directly in front of you. You have the compass, the astrolabe, the quadrant, and then you also have the caravel, which this ship allowed sailors or explorers to sail even against the winds. So if the wind was pushing against them, the way that the sails are adjusted or the way that they're made, it actually allows them to be able to sail into the wind and still get to where they needed to go, which was something that wasn't possible before. So these four things really help with allowing Europeans and allowing the Portuguese to start exploring a little bit and start venturing out into the Atlantic Ocean. And we're introduced to a man by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator. So Prince Henry the Navigator is actually a prince. He was a prince of Portugal. He had a navigation school. He wasn't a natural explorer. He never actually sailed anywhere, but he liked to teach other people how to do that, and he liked to finance projects. So he decides that he wants to make sure that the Portuguese are spreading Christianity and they're reducing the Muslim domination of the trading market. And so he starts this school for that very purpose, and he sponsors expeditions or trips up and down the west coast of Africa, up and down the coast of West Africa, excuse me. So by sailing through the Atlantic Ocean instead of going over land, the Portuguese actually hoped to reach sources of gold, ivory, and of course enslaved people that the Muslim merchants were transporting over the Great Sahara. So basically they wanted to give the Muslim merchants and the Muslim traders some competition for their money. Throughout the 1400s, the Portuguese continued to sail further and further away from home until finally they reached new territory. And you have here two people in front of you. Bartholomew Diaz. Bartholomew Diaz in 1487 actually sails around the tip of Africa. You can see the dotted red line. He actually goes around the tip of Africa, which is the first time that had ever happened. That had never happened before. No one really knew it was down there around the tip of Africa. So Diaz is the first man to do that. If you fast forward just a few years later in 1498, Vasco da Gama actually sails around the tip of Africa and makes it to India through a sailing route versus walking throughout Europe and Asia. So Diaz goes around the tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama actually reaches India, and he opens up this immensely profitable trade route for the Portuguese. And the Portuguese start to dominate southern and eastern trade routes around Africa because of these discoveries. Now, probably the most famous explorer that you guys know is Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus sails for Spain, but he is not Spanish. He's actually Italian. He was born in Italy, and he tries to convince the Spanish that instead of going around the tip of Africa to reach India, instead of going around Africa, we're just going to sail west. So you're going to leave Portugal, you're going to leave Spain, and you're just going to go west, and eventually if you sail long enough, you're going to hit Africa from the other side. They knew that the world was round. At this point, guys, Europeans know that the world is round. They're not scared that they're going to fall off. But they don't know that the continents of North and South America exist. They thought it was just ocean. And Christopher Columbus believes that the size of the earth is about 18,000 miles. That's what his idea was for the circumference of the earth. In reality, he was about 7,000 miles short. But regardless, after the Portuguese turn him down, Columbus finally gets the approval from Spain, and Spain gives him the 3 ships, and I know you guys probably know the story. And after sailing at sea for about a month, a little bit more than a month, he reaches the island of Bahamas. And when he gets there, again, they didn't know that North and South America existed. He thought he had reached the East Indies. He thought he basically had reached some islands of Asia. And that is why when he sees the natives there, instead of calling them, any other name, he calls them Indians because he thought he had reached India. And he believes that to his dying day. Christopher Columbus doesn't make one trip over to the New World. He actually makes 4 trips in total. And each time that he comes there, and if you're looking down at the map, each time that he comes there, he kind of visits different islands in the Caribbean, and he even hits a little bit the very tippy top of South America, but he never actually lands in North America. And in all 4 of these voyages that he had, he believes that he reached the East Indies. He believes that he had reached Asia, and again, he dies thinking that he had reached Asia, not knowing that he actually discovered 2 new continents. Once Christopher Columbus kind of opens those doors in 1492, the Spanish start to want to take control of more than just the Caribbean, basically. And you have these 3 guys that are pretty important for you to know. So the first one is in 1519, Hernan Cortez takes a group of volunteers, about 600 soldiers from Cuba, and they go to the coast of Mexico where he reaches the Aztec Empire. Now, the Aztecs were pretty hardcore Native Americans. They were very warlike and warriors. And when the Spanish soldiers get there, they're actually welcomed because they thought that they were gods. And the Native Americans welcome them with open arms, and eventually that leads to their demise because, of course, the Spanish and Cortez take down and take over the Aztecs in a very short period of time. You also have Francisco Pizarro that takes over the Inca Empire that's located in Peru with just 180 soldiers in the 1530s. And then you have Ferdinand Magellan that is credited with sailing the world, sailing around the whole wide world in 3 years. Now, Magellan actually does not finish the voyage. He ends up being killed somewhere near the Philippines today. But his crew keeps going on and wraps up the voyage for him. And so Magellan is given credit for sailing around the entire earth. And again, this was all done under the Spanish flag. The 3 reasons why not only these Spaniards or these explorers came over to the New World, but other explorers are going to follow are for these 3 reasons: God, gold, and glory. They wanted to spread Christianity, they wanted to find gold so they could become wealthy, and they wanted to make their country the biggest and baddest and best in the whole wide world, the glory part. Which leads us then to the Columbian Exchange. So you have Native Americans that are living here. You have Europeans that are coming over exploring, thinking that they found, Asia, but then they realize that they were really not in Asia, that they found something new. And you have the start of the Columbian Exchange. So what does this term mean? This term is used to describe the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between Europe and the Americas. And the Columbian Exchange helped trigger enormous population shifts around the world. So, if you look at the arrows, from Europe into the Americas, you have things like cattle, pigs, horses. Horses were something that the Native Americans had never seen. You have rice and oats and peaches and coffee and grapes and bananas. These were things that were not in the Americas that were not native to the Americas that the Native Americans had never seen before. On the flip side, you also had those items that were from North America into Europe, and that included things like corn and turkeys and pumpkins and peppers and sweet potatoes and pineapples and tobacco. Those are the things that the Americas gave back to Europe. Now, the one thing that Europe also gave the Americas, not just different animals and different fruits and grains and things of that nature, but it also gave diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, malaria. And the reason why Native Americans died off so fast and by such large numbers when the Europeans start coming is because of these diseases. They were not immune to these diseases, so their bodies had never been introduced to it. Once their bodies became introduced to it, their immune system did not know how to fight it off. It was like brand new. And so their bodies were very vulnerable to these diseases. And the Native Americans would die off very quickly. Whole tribes would be completely gone in a matter of years after working with and being in close quarters to Europeans. So this is the exchange, guys, between the old world, which is Europe and Africa, and the new world, North and South America. I want you guys to think how the Columbian Exchange affected the environment in the Americas, and then how did it also affect the Native Americans, because the Columbian Exchange is really important for you guys to actually get and understand. So make sure that you actually study that chart that you saw on the previous page and that you're able to answer these two questions. And just as a little tidbit, just as a little FYI, how did America actually get its name? Because a lot of people say that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Well, you guys just learned that Christopher Columbus doesn't actually discover America because he doesn't land in America. He lands in the Caribbean, but he does discover the New World. He does discover that there's a North and South America, even though he doesn't know it at the time. We actually get the name America from another explorer by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. And Amerigo Vespucci in the early 1500s publishes a book that says that he has traveled South America, and he gives recognition that it's a new continent, not Asia. And European map makers read this book and decide to give this new landmass credit to Amerigo Vespucci, and they name it a variation of his name, America, which is obviously what our name is today. Years and years later, historians realized that Amerigo was actually lying about what he explored and what he saw. But regardless, it was too late. America is the name that it was given, and it's a name that we've stuck with. Had Christopher Columbus perhaps realized that he had discovered new continents versus thinking that he landed somewhere in Asia, maybe we would have been named something, involving Columbus or some sort of variation of his name. But instead, we got stuck with Amerigo Vespucci. So that brings us, guys, to the end of our video. You have 7 questions here. Now remember, you don't need to answer these questions, but your notes should have the answers to every single one of these questions. If they don't, you need to go back, rewatch the video, make sure that you fill in the holes in your notes. If you have any questions, write them down so that you don't forget. And otherwise, I will see you guys in class.